Hey everybody, today's video is called What Can We Learn from Jesus Feeding the 5,000? And today we step out of our pass-through study in the book of Ezekiel, where we're going to be looking at our third topical Saturday for the year of 2025. And we look here today at a significant miracle of Jesus that's recorded in all four of the Gospels. But we're going to look at the account of John and cross over to Matthew for the most part of it, or for the majority of it. And so John chapter 6 verse 1 through 14, it says, "After these things Jesus went over to the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs, which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, but every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?' Then Jesus said, 'Make the people sit down.' And there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to his disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, 'Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost.' Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were over by those who had eaten. Then those men who had seen the sign that Jesus did said, 'This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world.'" So when Jesus fed the masses that day, he began with the 5 barley loaves and 2 fish borrowed from this boy's lunch. And I want to go over to the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 14. And let's look at verse 21. It says, "Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." So the Apostle Matthew he specified that there were 5,000 men alone. This did not include the women and children. So Bible scholars believe to be estimated about 15,000 to 20,000 people were fed by Jesus' miracle here. So oftentimes we only think of the 5,000, but that's not including women and children that's given in detail by the Apostle Matthew. And a few verses up from there, in Matthew 14, verse 15, 16, it says, "And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, so that they may go in the villages and buy themselves food.' But Jesus said to them, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.'" So Jesus' disciples wanted to send the people away because evening was approaching and they were in a remote place. But Christ wanted his disciples to give them something to eat. In verses 17 through 21, "And they said to him, 'We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish.' He said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes." In verse 20, "So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained." So Jesus called for the fish and the bread to be brought to him. As he went on to give thanks for the meal, he broke the bread and then gave it to his disciples so that they could disperse it out to the crowd. And Jesus provided as much as they wanted, and they ate and they were satisfied. And I want to go over the gospel according to Mark chapter 6. Mark 6:43. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. So Jesus doesn't just meet the need we should take note of here with the miracle of the 5,000. Jesus didn't just make the need. He gave more than enough for leftovers. And one thing that we should think about when we see this passage is that our problems are never too big for God. They are never too large for God to handle. And I want to go over to the book of Psalm 132. Psalm 132, verse 15. It says, I will abundantly bless her provision. I will satisfy her poor with bread. So one thing we should learn is that God doesn't only provide, but he gives in abundance. In Psalm 23, verse 5, we're going to be wrapping up here. Psalm 23:5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. So we see that our shepherd, our good shepherd, provides for our needs, and even abundantly. So keep that in mind when you think of a miracle that seems really interesting here. It's more than just interesting. It shows us the compassion of Christ. So we'll see you next, and I'll let you know when that video will be as we go back into our study of the book of Ezekiel, looking at chapter 13 on the foolish false prophets. So have a great rest of your weekend. God bless.